Right. So I wanted to just do a very basics of kind of Unity interface. I touch on a lot of this over and over again, but sometimes I find this helps. So let's start with a new scene. So file, new scene, and I'm going to do basic URP, and I'm going to hit don't save. And then for the layout here, I'm just going to do a basic 2x3, and then I usually grab my project tab and I drag it below my hierarchy. And just by clicking on this tab and moving it around. I have one of these really, really great widescreen monitors, so it gives me a lot of room, and I usually dock extra stuff inside of that. For my project tab, this is all of the things that are on your hard drive that you can drag into your game, and this is the hierarchy here is everything in your game. So, for example, you can see I have a main camera in my scene, and I have a directional light. I usually take this and I make it a one column layout so that it's easier for me to read. I can make new folders and all that good stuff inside of here. So here's our scene view. This is essentially how we manipulate, move around our scene. This is our objects that we use. So this is really where we're building our game world. We also have this game view here. This is what this is the camera that we're looking at, which is this guy right here. So as I move this around, you're not noticing anything. But this is what we're actually looking at. So for example, if I reset this position here by clicking on these three dots in my inspector, I can reset the transform of that to 000, which is the world, and I'll just pull it back. And if I right click in here and I go to 3D object cube, you can see it creates a cube right in front. Now, what's interesting is when we select these objects, main camera, directional light, cube, you'll notice that the inspector changes. The inspector is essentially all of the components. This is a component right here. This is another component. These are all of the things that make up what that object is. So for example, when I select this directional light, I can adjust the color, and this is like the color that the light is casting in the scene. And notice that the object changes as well because the this light is what's essentially casting light on this object. So for example, if I create a 3D object plane and I bring this down below my cube, and the way I was able to bring this up here is I hit W, or I can click on this guy here for my move tool. And you can see if I move my camera up this way, I hit E, or I click the rotation here. So there's a W for move, E for rotate. You can see I can move my camera like this. You can see there's a shadow here. And if I hit E on this and I rotate this, you can see the shadow rotates with it. So if I want to, have the shadow face the camera like this, and notice that this camera is also, or this light is also directly connected to the world. So we can get nighttime and daytime. So there's these 3D objects in the scene. I'm gonna hit F to focus on this, F like Frank. And say I'd like to scale this out. If you look up in the right-hand corner here, there is this axis controller, right? You can see there's an X-axis, a Z-axis, and a Y-axis. If I hit R on my keyboard, this is my scale tool. You can see I can scale up on each one of these axes, this cube. We are also going to install a package called ProBuilder later when you're actually doing the project, and that'll allow you to manipulate this object to form it into things like houses and stuff like that. All right, sorry, I had a little glitch. So let's go ahead and let's delete this cube. And we have a plane in our scene, and I'm going to just make sure this plane is on 0 on the x-axis and 0 on the z-axis. And then I'm going to click in my scene, and we go to 3D object, and I'm going to create a capsule. And I like using capsules as stand-ins for characters. I'm going to click these three dots here. I'm going to reset it. I'm going to move him above the plane. I'm going to rename this capsule player by clicking on the capsule and then selecting it in the inspector and then renaming the name here. Now, let's move it up a little bit above the ground. Now, there's different things that happen inside of 3D environments. There's your game objects, there's your floor, things like that. I'm going to go ahead and add a component, and I'm going to type in rigid body. Now, if you've ever taken the Blender physics class with me, you'll notice that there are rigid bodies that are attached to this capsule, and there's rigid bodies in Blender, and this represents physics. So if I lift this above the ground, notice that this capsule has a capsule collider, and this plane has a mesh collider that came by default when I plugged it in. I'm going to actually just deactivate the mesh collider by clicking this check mark, and I'm going to press play. And you'll notice that my capsule falls through the floor. Now I'm going to re-enable this mesh collider, and I'm going to press play. So you can see what happened. Well, the mesh collider stopped the capsule from moving through the ground. Now, this rigid body here is what provides physics inside of Unity. So if I give this a little bit of, I make it a little bit off center and I press play, you can see it tilts over and it falls and it rocks. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Control Z there, hit Control Z a couple more times, just kind of moving this back to the ground. I'm also going to select my plane here and I'm going to hit R and I'm going to scale this out like this, just giving us a place because I'd like to show you guys the basics of how to make a character walk. Something else that's bothering me is I'm not a huge fan of this shadow, so I'm going to select this light, hit Control D, move it over this way, and then hit E, and I'm going to let this light control the tint of the overall scene. I also don't want it to have any shadows, so I'm going to hit no shadows for this light, so that way it doesn't cast a shadow. If I turn on shadows, you're going to see we get the double shadow effect if I increase the intensity here, and they kind of fight each other, and I don't want that. So I'm going to do no shadows here, and I'm just going to bring that intensity down a little bit because I just want to tint the scene, and maybe I'll give it a nice soft blue, make it feel pretty good. Increase the intensity a little bit. And I kind of like that look. Like it's just, I don't know. Nice, like a nice tint. And then what you can do with this directional lights, you can almost treat this like the sun and just kind of increase the intensity or not if you want the scene to have a little bit more warmth. All right. Now in my project tab, I'm going to go to assets here and I'm going to create a new folder. And I'm going to call this test scene. And inside of this test scene, that's where I'm going to put all of my stuff that goes into this test scene. Now, normally I'll actually create a test build level, and that'll be like a character running around and jumping and things like that. And that's where I only focus on character movement. And then I'll import that character or instantiate it into the scene, like the world, if it's a city or something. So we're going to treat this scene as our test scene. So the way that you save a scene is you do File, Save As, and then I'm going to go into my test scene folder, and I'm going to save this off as test scene. And what you'll notice now is this test scene folder now has this test scene within it. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is we have our test scene in here. I'm going to actually create a folder in here and just call this art. And generally, I would break this up into, like if you look in here, games, I have art, prefabs, particles, scripts, all that stuff. Because this is just going to be a test scene that's probably going to get deleted anyway after this lecture. I'm just going to go ahead inside of here and throw all of my art in here and prefabs. So what I'd like to do is create a material. So I'm going to go to right click, go to create the material at the top, and I'm just going to call this player material. And here's my player, and I'm going to drag this player material onto my player here. Another way of doing that is you could look in the components, or you can drag it over here on the side somewhere, like actually down at the bottom, and you can see it adjusted up. Now that material that was created has this white tint. It doesn't have that dark gray, so it actually looks pretty nice. If you'd like, you can go in here and just adjust the color of this so that it stands out a little bit better. I kind of like, again, I'm sort of into these moods of like kind of like light blues today. And then the floor itself, I tend to make that desaturated, so I'm going to create another material. A trick is you could hit Control D to duplicate that, and then I can rename this ground material. And I can grab this ground material, drop it on the floor, and then I can just adjust the color of this ground material as well. And like I said, I tend to make it a little bit darker. Try to find something that offsets it a little bit. It stands out. So there we go. All right. Now, because we're using Unity 6 or later for this demo, what we're going to do is we're going to be using something called visual scripting. And I think it's a great way to start to learn to code is to use a visual scripting environment. This is sort of the same thing they do for MIT coursework for kids or for other adults. And honestly, most technical artists use some sort of visual scripting framework for shaders and things like that. So it's a great way to get you acclimated into the world of coding if you have no coding experience. So I'm going to go ahead and click Add Component here. And I'm going to type script, and you'll see the second option, I haven't even finished typing it, is script machine. So I'm going to go ahead and add that. Now, script machine is how we actually create a graph for our create these visual node graphs in our scene. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to dock that visual scripting graph down below. So I'm going to go ahead and hit new here. And you can see it's prompting us to ask us what name do you want to save your graph and then where do you want to save it. I'm just going to go into my test scene folder. And you can, if you're pretty retentive, you can say script and then just go inside of here and then name this player controller. And that's anything that's to do with the player movement. And I can hit save here. And what you'll notice is it created that script folder with player controller. And if I double click this player controller, or if I select the player here, and you can see there's this player controller script here, and I hit edit graph, you can see it opens up my script graph. Now, what you can do is you can dock it, to the left or right here. Let's see if I can kind of scale this down quite a bit so we can dock it in our scene. So something like this. And now we have this docked in our view. And if I hold Alt and Enter, I can click on each one of these scenes. Maybe it's just our movement or... Used to be able to, let's see. It's okay. Used to be able to hit Alt Enter, or maybe it's just the way that I have it set up here to zoom in on a single view. But what I can do is whenever I'm working in here, I can just hit full screen here. And then if you click full screen again, it'll go down. Now, what you'll notice with the script is it has these two nodes, and these two nodes actually represent real code. So here's on start and here's on update. And these are real methods that you're going to program later, but just kind of looking at the environment here. So you have a script graph here, and then down here you have a way of saving variables. And variables are really just, you could think of them as a box that stores data. This is all going to sound like word salad until we actually get to moving around and setting this up. So let's take a look at how these two essentially functions work. You can think of them as like little machines. So this says on start, and what this means is as the game starts, so after I press play, any node that comes after this, it'll run it just once. On update is run essentially every frame. So it'll run continuously. So let's just take a look at a very simple way of how we test code, and that's using debug messages, as well as how we can test if these methods are working. Because remember, this visual script is attached. It's inside of this player object here. So anything we do inside of the script affects essentially this capsule player. So a couple of ways to do this. You can right click and you can select add node. You can hold control and right click, and then you'll get this add node window. And all of the nodes are broken up. You can see variables, player stuff that affects our player. All of this logic math is broken up in these categories. It can feel a little daunting at first, but the more you play with this, the easier it gets. Because for instance, if I click on time, you can see these are all of the time nodes that exist. And these all correspond to real programming logic, like you could type wait for seconds when you're actually scripting. So let's go ahead and hit control and right click, and let's do debug. And debug logs a message to our console. So if you go to window and then you go up to general and then you go to console here, this is our console window. And I generally use this console window to say, okay, did my player bump into a character, or I can spit out things to the scene. For now, I just want to show you that this works. So I'm going to go ahead and link these two nodes together. And then for my message here, what kind of message do I want to put to the screen? Well, I can actually create a string literal or a variable. So what I'm going to do is just type the word string, and string just represents a string of letters. And you can see there's a little line here. And if I click on this, it'll give me the different parts of different things I can do. I can create a string. I'm just going to use a string literal. And what that means is whatever's inside of this box, it's just going to use that. So I'm going to type hello inside of this box, and I'm going to link this to this message here. I'm going to hit Control S to save this. I believe you could also just, let's see. I think there's a save button somewhere. I guess just hit Control S to save it for now. Now look in this console window over here. If I press play, you'll notice that it prints hello. And you can see up here, there's one little like exclamation point, like warning message. This is really the warning message, but this is more of like the console, and it says hello. And that's what we did here. Now, to show you how update works is I can actually just link this here, and I can stop it. I mean, you saw that it kept going, but I want to show you sort of with this thing detached. I'm going to hold Alt Sorry, I'm going to select this, or right click, sorry. Right click will break the bond. Now remember, update runs every frame. So I'm going to clear the console. I'm going to press play again. And you can see now this number just keeps going up. So, I don't know what I'm getting, like 300 frames a second or something. And you can see we've already got like over 1,000 of this word hello being printed. So I'm going to right click here and I'm going to delete these because we don't need them. And I'm going to move this back. Now, let's say we wanted to move our character, right? We have on start here and we have update. And there's another one that I like to use when there's an object that has physics on it. Now, remember, this guy does have physics. We added this rigid body. And what that is I'm going to hold control and right click. And I'm going to start typing the word fixed and update. And you can see there's this, it says on fixed update. And if I click on that, you can see this has a coroutine and it's actually something that runs. And you can see this dotted line. And this indicates that this is a loop, just like this update loop. It constantly runs, but it deals with physics objects. Now let's say we want to move this. One of the components that's part of this rigid body is the ability to add force to move our object forward, right? So I can actually just right click or hold control and right click and just start typing add force. And here's rigid body add force. And you can see here there's force mode, force XYZ mode. If I just click on this, this is the generic one that's used. It gives you pretty much the connection to all of these different axes. So if I want to link these, I can link these together. And these little dots here, you see it looks like a transform component. This is a transform component. This represents the X, Y, and Z axis. How do I know that? If I look at my player here, you can see that we have a position here. That's what this represents, this transform. And we have an X, Y, and Z axis. So that's what these represent. So say I want on my Z axis my player to move forward. I can type in this Z axis 5. And remember, this runs every frame. So I'm going to save this and I'll press play. And let's see what happens in our scene. You could see that it's constantly adding force and moving my capsule on the Z-axis. Now, if I wanted to have more of an appearance of it moving without rolling, I can actually go into my rigid body here and I can constrain that movement on the X-axis because it's actually rotating like this. So if I press play, you can see it's sort of moving. It's frozen. Let's actually make this 100 maybe. Yeah, I just needed a little bit more force because I froze it. So let's make this 20 maybe. You can see now he's like really chugging along. Let's do 10. All right, so let's actually do this same setup, but use keyboard input. Now, what I want to do is I only want to affect the Z-axis, but you probably notice, well, this is kind of weird because you have them like sort of locked in here. Is there any way that we can access these individually as each one of these having their own little node? And we can do that. What we want to do is we want to create a vector 3 which has an X, Y, and Z. And what this does is this breaks this into 3 different axes. So now we have a little bit more. We have a little bit more control over X, Y, and Z. And so what I can do, for example, is like, let's say let's just kind of give you an example here. Let's say we want to move him on the Z or move this capsule. Or whatever your character's design is. And so we want to move them 10, let's say. And I press play. You can see that my character kind of floats down. I want my character to essentially stay on the ground, let's say, for example. I can actually get the, let's just focus on player movement, or we can have it drop down immediately. So let's see if we actually can we get rigid body? Get force. Constant force? No, I think that'll give us the constant thing. Let's just focus on the X and Y, like moving our character left and right. So up at the top, if we go to edit project settings, you'll notice that there is a input system. This is what we generally use. I use this now as the new input manager, and you'll get into that later. But right now I want to keep it simple. So there's a new system, they like to call it new, but it's pretty old at this point. And then there's the older system, which is the input manager here. And what's nice about this system is it lets you prototype pretty quickly. So if I open up this where it says horizontal here, you could see that horizontal is mapped to the left and the right and the A and D key. This is great to use because I want to move my character when I press the A or D key or the left and right arrow code, left and right, as my player moves, right? So let's say in my game, I want it to always be moving on the z-axis. So let's actually move this character down to here. You can see we have now force, our character's moving, and I want to be able to move it A and D on the A and D axis. So what I can do is control right click, or just, it looks like it's allowing me to just right click. And I'm going to type in input. And you can see here that we have all these different inputs. And we want to do input, get axis. And then it says axis name, and that's fine. Because the name that we want to get is if we, let me bring that back up one more time. And I suggest you do the same, is you want to grab the way that it's spelled here, horizontal, just copy it, and then just paste it in here. And now you can see that we're getting our, this is actually getting when I push the A and D key. All right, so let's go ahead and connect this to our X input. So now we're getting in all of those key inputs and it's being fed in. I believe it's going to be a little slow, so I'll show you how to multiply that in a second. But yeah, I'm not getting much movement. It's very, very light. I actually want to move this maybe much slower too. Let's make this 5 and let's press play. You can see, yeah, it's just kind of, it's moving, but it's really rocking slowly. So let's actually lock the y-axis too so it doesn't lean on our player for that rotation. I'm really just freezing. Now actually we can freeze the Z too because we're not going to be turning. So in order to adjust this, I can actually drag this out, and I'm just going to type MUL for multiply, and I'll add a multiply node, and I'll connect this here. Oh, actually it looks like I need to multiply. Let's do multiply here. And we want to do, I think it's this one, math and scalar, yeah. And so now if I connect this to X and I make this something like 10, and I save this, and I press play, we should be able to move left and right, and it's kind of sliding. There is a better node aside from add force here, and there's a set velocity node. And what this does is this actually just sets the velocity, which means the movement of it. So I'm going to go ahead and just right click and type velocity. And this will not make it so slidey. So let's look for, let's see, rigid body, set linear velocity here. And on this one, I can just link these up, and I can link this node up here. And now if I save this and I press play, you can see it moves, much stiffer. Let's go ahead and make this like a 2. So it's not really pushing it like it's adding force like it's on ice. It's moving more like it's more responsive. And let's see, we can also, you can see we have these output here, like these get variables. Say I want to add a integer node that I can control on my character here. Well, there's a graph one, which exists only in this graph, a variable. There's an object, and then there's a scene variable. If I hit plus here, it says please enter a variable name. So I'm going to name this speed. And I'm going to hit plus, and then I'm going to change the data type here to, we could do a float if we want more incremental, that's a 0. And you could see here on our variables, let's see, if I save my graph, let's see our player, here's our script graph. You know what, let me actually right click and remove this. I think I am looking for an object. This variable are shared across the current game object, graph. These are local to the current graph. Yeah, I think I'm looking for an object variable. So I'm going to name this one speed. Hit plus. There we go. Now you can see my speed variable appeared. I'm going to change this to a float. And I'm going to save this. And I'm going to drag this out. I'm going to get this variable, which is speed. And I'm going to link it up here. Now when I save this, anything I type in the inspector here, I can adjust in the scene. So let's make this 5. And I press play. And you can see now my variable here is multiplying by 5, the axis. So that's kind of cool. I think that's it for this lesson. That's really just an introduction to Script Canvas. So I would go through this, watch this video before you do the 2D monster game, just to kind of get acclimated and a little bit more comfortable with Unity Graph.